Well, now that you have had a look at the learning activities in the previous recording, and maybe you have also had a look at the previous week's activities, especially week 2 when we spoke about discourse and language. It is now very important at this point to see what Baki has to tell us about, social problems. And I'll also try to introduce you in this recording to the WPR approach itself. So Baki really suggests that policy has an undeniable cultural dimension. It takes shape within specific historical and national or international context. In this sense, it is appropriate to think about policy in anthropological terms as a cultural product. This way of approaching policy, asking questions about its sources and how it operates, is part of a larger project to understand how governing takes place and with what implications for those being governed. So what Baki is really saying here is that what is viewed as acceptable or appropriate policies varies by cultural context and also varies within historical time, but even within space as well, as we started saying. For example, if we were to put forward a policy today saying that women are allowed to work only until they are married, and then no longer being allowed to work, that kind of policy here in Queensland and many other countries would be disputed, and it would even create some sort of outrage. So that wouldn't be accepted at all in this society where we are now committed to, gender equality and treating women in a fair way. Compared to, of course, a few decades ago, for example, when those kinds of laws and policies could be tolerated because of, now how we have shifted from perceiving gender norms from one time to this specific and contemporary time. And that example applies to many other contexts. If we were to think, for example, about corporal punishment being allowed in schools, that policy might not get, any support at all, because now we understand that it is the right of children not to be abused at all, and physical abuse not being accepted at any time at all. But that was not the case again in the 1950s or those old ages, as I started saying in the previous recording. So just really reminding us how norms, keep influencing, and cultural norms in particular keep influencing what policies are acceptable at a certain point in time and what policies get not to be accepted at another time. And that in itself is not dynamic. It keeps changing with time. Now, this takes us to the way we problematize, policies and the way we get to define problems. If you can recall when we spoke about policy as a problem solving in week 2, we started by thinking and defining different ways in which policies are understood, and policy problems in particular, which we started thinking in terms of policy solutions, and that views policy as a solution to fixed things, fixed problems. And this takes us to a kind of positivist understanding of social problems, which is quite different from, the subjective framings of social policy problems we started speaking about in the previous recording in this week's lecture. So in this context, policy is seen as a response to something which is identifiable, and that is the problem, or something which is observable. And this is actually the idea which Carol Baki in her WPR approach is challenging, that policies are not neutral, They are not neutral tools that fix objective problems. And instead, policies construct problems through language and framing. And that, policies reflect power dynamics and cultural assumptions. And again, all these are quite subjective rather than objective. And the way we define problems is quite a subjective process. And that's what I said when I said sometimes it's the dominant narrative which gets to shape what problems can get prioritized, what problems can't be prioritized. And of course, that policies shape what is seen as relevant, urgent, and even solvable problems. And this, again, is quite a dynamic, reflection that we don't always think of problems in the same way all the times and everywhere. So a clear example of this, and I will speak very much about problematization as a process of defining the problems, because unless, as I said in week one, everything you do in social policy, the key point and the starting and very important point is always about problem identification. You can't put a policy forward for a problem you don't understand. And now the way we define a problem, which Baki refers to as problematization, gets to shape our choices and our actions towards addressing that problem. For example, if you want to go to a supermarket, maybe to buy some groceries, you might have a few implicit problems. So you might not be putting those problems forward, but technically these are the representations which are really guiding the choices you make as to how do you go to the shopping center, which shopping center do you go to, do you go there by public transport, do you drive, do you go walking? So all those are decisions which you end up taking based on the implicit problem, which maybe you might not even be thinking for. For example, if your problem is about time management, maybe you have many other tasks to do that day and you are like, I need to get to the shopping center and just spend a few minutes just buying some groceries and then get back home. That can define what you prioritize between driving and, even taking public transport to get to that shopping center. Or if your problem is not about time and is rather about your budget, then that might define which shopping center do you go to. Do you prioritize going to a shopping center where you can find the cheapest possible items? Or do you prioritize just going to any shopping center, which is maybe even far away, provided that to that shopping center you get the cheapest possible items you need. So again, you see clearly how all of these tell you what problems are you trying to address. And this is how policy practice operates and policy analysis. It's all about which problems are you trying to address. And Baki puts this in a certain way that most times, including in government actions, the problems are not explicitly mentioned. They are often unconscious, but they still get to shape what factors you consider and what you weigh up, and ultimately what you end up choosing in solving those problems. So the way we define the problem, the problematization process, gets to frame our choices and our actions. And again, all that is quite subjective. It's not something which is objective in itself. We can think of many other examples, like the way we even think about sources of problems. We can take a specific problem like homelessness. Some people might view that as a result of bad decisions made by individuals, and that can suggest different solutions like providing education around decision making, and that might lead to behavioral change. And that's, for us, maybe the best way to address that. But the same problem, if we understand it as a result of mental health problems, then we might shift the solutions we put forward And we might think of things like providing supported accommodation that links residents to mental health services. But the same problem, if we think of it as a result of welfare dependency, we might suggest other different solutions which we put forward. So just really giving you an idea on how problem definition, problem identification, the whole process of problematization gets to define the means and ends of social policy. You can still remember this debate we had, or this discussion we had in week 3 around the means and ends of social policy, and you can see it always really being relatable on this slide. So that, in a sense, really problematizes in itself the way we think about social problems in government ways. And Baki argues that most government policies do not officially declare that there is a problem that the policy will address and remedy. Rather, this is implicit in the whole notion of policy. By their nature, policies make changes implying that something needs to change. So again, what Baki is really saying here is that policy problems are implied rather than clearly stated, and that policy proposals give shape to policy problems, and that we can understand the problem by looking at a policy solution. And that problematization, as I said, is a central process of governing or governmentality, if you like. So this takes us to the whole idea of the WPR approach, which simply challenges the commonplace view that policy is government's best attempt to deal with problems. And in this conventional understanding of public policy, governments are seen to be reacting to fixed and identifiable problems that are exogenous or outside the policy process. So this is the core idea that the whole WPR approach is trying to challenge, that problems are not really fixed. They are not always as straightforward as they appear, but we construct them through the solutions we put forward. And those solutions themselves are quite underpinned by the values and beliefs we have as government or as people in general. So the WPR approach is all about key questions, 6 questions you ask in trying to understand and analyze policies. And the first of this question is, what is the problem represented to be? This is the first question you really ask. And that question takes you to have a clearer grasp of the problem you want to address. So this requires us to work backward from policy solution to understand the change people want. And that's clearly what they see as the problem. And as I said, this is where you are likely to start in most approaches to policy analysis, even if you are not using Baki's WPR approach. In many other approaches, you still use the first thing is to identify what the problem is. The second question in Baki's model is, what assumptions, that is the knowledge, that is taken for granted and underlying this representation of the problem. And the third question, maybe for the second assumption, the second question, I have to say that these assumptions are like the roots of the tree, allowing the problematization to make sense. Because unless you focus on these assumptions, then you won't understand clearly the problem. Then the next question is, how did the representation of the problem come about? And this in particular considers the cultural and temporal context in which the policy emerged. And of course, the next question is, what is left unproblematic in the problem representation? What aspect of the problems people are not talking about so far? What silences are there? And this is clearly where discourse comes in, as it sets bounds around what is knowable, what people know already about the problem, what they don't know already, and what else still needs to be known about the problem before even we can move on to start thinking of anything else regarding that problem. So Baki really challenges us at this point to think about how else this problem could be thought about. That's exactly what is not being said so far about the problem. And the fifth question is, what effects are produced by this representation of the problem? And the last question is, how and where has this particular representation of the problem been produced, disseminated, and defended? How could it be questioned, disputed, or even replaced? So in the next mini lecture, we shall focus more on these questions, and we shall try to apply an example to each of these questions and see what they really mean in reality. And just a reminder, this approach is a key focus of your second assessment. And you would have realized that many things we have said so far really applies to your second assessment. What we really need for our second assessment are these three questions, which are highlighted. What is the problem represented to be? What assumptions, knowledge that is taken for granted underlie this representation of the problem? And what is left unproblematic in the problem representation? Where are the silences? So these are the three questions we shall be responding to in our second assessment. And what I will do, I will give you the policy statements on which you will be basing your analysis while applying these three questions. So thank you very much. And in the next workbook, we shall explore more how to apply all these questions in details. So I think at this point, you'll now be able to have deepened your understanding of discourse and the role it plays in policy. You should also be able at this point to explain how social policies frame issues as certain types of problems. And you should also be able to outline back his WPR approach to policy analysis. See you in the next module.